Thank you very much, and it's a real pleasure and a true honor to be here in Arkansas, as Congressman Snyder was saying, and I thank him for very kind words. It's really the first time I'm here with my wife Colette and Cameron Griffith, who is from the French Embassy staff, and we are discovering every minute this great state of yours, and let me tell you how pleased we are, and I think you will regret it because I will come back and you'll have much more of me as we go along. Thank you very much for inviting me, and thank you, Mr. Rutherford, for inviting me to this impressive Clinton School. The settings are outstanding, I must say, and it is really something to be here, such a nice crowd. And there is a bit of French arrogance to come here and to talk to you about diplomacy after everything President Clinton did while he was here and left a great and impressive record of his diplomatic skills. And to come here and lecture you on the diplomacy and what the world is today looks like being a little bit of a megalomaniac attitude on my behalf. But anyway, I'll try to give you what is mostly a French view of what is going on in the world today and what is French positions about it. Because I think this may be of some interest afterwards for the Q&A session that I hope we're going to have, and that will be, I hope, as lively as possible, because this is usually the best part of those meetings, of course, is when you ask your question and the French ambassador makes a fool of himself trying to answer them and remain as diplomatic as possible. But let's go on, and let's go quickly through the first preliminary remarks. What I would like to do is give you quite a few insight of what France's attitude is to the global world we're facing, and the kind of understanding of what is going on at the moment and what we think is going on in the world today, and then give you maybe a few insight of also of what is our position on the main issues we're facing. I think what we will all agree is that we're going into a totally new world because it is a global world. Maybe where we need to be a little bit more precise is about what are the main features of this new world. And maybe with the risk of oversimplifying what is it all about, let me try to explain to you what we think in France are the, I would say, the three realities of today's global world. Because what this global world is all about is we have gone from what was mostly a rather simplistic and simplified international community at the time. You know, at the time when we were facing mostly one major competitor and one major opponent, which was the East against the West, the Soviet Union and its allies against the West, which meant the United States and its allies, even if France from time to time wanted to play its own autonomous role. The truth was it was mainly East against West. And now we've gone to something that is really much more complex, and the complexity of the world we're facing today is very impressive. And it is impressive because, first of all, you have a lot of new actors and a lot of numerous actors, of course, in the world today. Let me just give you an example, and I try to go through with examples because I think this is always the most interesting to understand. Take, for instance, the Iranian crisis we're going through at the moment. And you know there is this group of the what we call the P5+1, which is the 5 permanent members of the Security Council in New York, to which we have added Germany. So it's this group of the 5+1 which is in charge of managing this crisis and trying to outreach to the Iranians so that they at last will come to the table of negotiations. We have failed so far, but what you have to understand is even with such a simple presentation of things, in fact it's much more complicated than that. And every time, every day, every month, every year, the 5+1 have to outreach to many other actors in the world today so that we have them on board and keep them with us in order to have a sort of unanimous position. So what we try to do time and again while we try to bring the Iranians to the negotiations is talk with Brazil, talk with South Africa, talked with Indonesia or many other countries, so that these countries can also put pressure on Iran and the Tehran authorities, so that everybody works together to push them in the right direction. This is something that 10 or 15 years ago you would never have thought of. French diplomats, British diplomats going to Brazil to talk about Iran. This was certainly not the kind of things we were doing, and this is totally new. And you could say the same thing, for instance, if you look at the present and major African crisis, what's happening in Darfur, what's happening in the Great Lakes area, what's happening in the Democratic Republic of Congo. You have to work with new institutions that were not there about 20 years ago. In Africa, one of the most important being, of course, the African Union, that it gathers all the African countries, and that is today the main force in trying to reach agreements here and there. They have special envoys that work on the Darfur issue, for instance, and then we picked up also an envoy from Qatar, because Qatar said they were ready to help, and therefore on an issue like Darfur, you have an envoy from the African Union, an envoy from Qatar, who are the main diplomats working on this issue, with all the major countries supporting them. You have also your special envoy here, General Gratian, who is talking a lot with these two people and trying to see how they can get out of this. This is a totally new scene on the international community, and you had nothing of that a few years ago. So new actors, but of course also new challenges, and this is the second feature. Challenges that we were not discussing very much about a few years ago, whether it be on the political side or on the economic side. Let me explain to you. On the political side, let's take an example. The peace process, as it has been going on more or less since the 1967 war between Israel and the Arab countries. As time has gone by, the complexity of that process has become more and more obvious. And if you take a quick snapshot of how things are going on today, you have two new features in that issue that are totally new for the last 7 or 8 years, and that weren't there about 10 or 15 years ago. First of all, you have the influence of Iran, that is there very much so, playing with parties like Syria or with the divisions inside the Palestinian movement. I'll come back to that in a second. You have also the whole divisions between Sunnis and Shiites in the Arab world that is also playing its part at the moment in this process. And of course, you have the deep division among the Palestinian movement itself, with the Fatah and the Palestinian authorities on one side, working and living in Ramallah, and in Gaza, the Hamas movement, which has totally split from the other one, and that is refusing absolutely for the time being to unite again with them. And of course, this has brought a complexity into the issue that is very difficult to manage and a terrible challenge to all of us. That's an example for the political side, but take the economic side, for instance, and where we have gone through with all the economic and financial market crisis in the recent months. But think about the climate change also, and all this new negotiation that have been going on since the Kyoto Convention, and that is slowly bringing now to a new meeting point at Copenhagen before the end of the year. The impact of the climate change and the challenges it represents is very obvious when you look at the agenda of the G8 or meetings as they have been going on now for the last year. Climate change is at top of the agenda. It wasn't there about 5 or 6 years ago. There was nothing similar to where we are today. And of course, you could go on with many other challenges that we're facing. As always, the development assistance. But think about the whole issue about immigration, and it is growing on European nations as we're facing more and more pressure from the poor African countries who are pushing slowly many of their immigrants into our borders, and that is creating huge problems, not only in France, but if you look at all the countries around Europe, it's the same. Italy, Spain, the national election are about immigration and what their national government are going to do with these new immigrants coming in. So this is another challenge that is very obvious and very important. And the third feature I wanted very quickly to mention here is, of course, that all these new actors, these new challenges are creating not only a very complex situation, but a reality that is totally intertwined and totally relying on interdependence among the challengers and the actors. Let me give you here also two examples that you will understand very clearly and very quickly. Take the challenge of climate change. If we go on like that and we have more problems with climate, more difficult and severe weather as it's going on, if that creates new problem with water resources, if you go on and you have countries taking measures with regard to climate change and taking protectionist measures to refuse other countries to come in and to send their goods and services to your country because they have not applied the same kind of provisions that you are applying if you take up a tax, a carbon tax or a cap and trade system that you set in. That means that from climate change, you go right up to questions related with trade, with questions related to poverty in some African countries, and the same question of immigration that arise, the same question of to share scarce resources in all our countries on air, on water, on whatever it is. And therefore you discover that from the single prospect of looking at climate change from an environment perspective, you have to go on and look at many more issues that are related to that, trade, immigration, and many other things. And that brings a lot of complexity there and a lot of difficult issues that are not easy to manage and to solve as we go along. And the same thing I could say about actors. Links between actors now are becoming more and more complicated. Look, for instance, at an issue as the one we're facing in Latin America, in Central America today with Honduras. That is maybe not a very easy solution, easy problem to solve. But I would say that 15 or 20 years ago, you could have arranged that rather easily with a mediation or go-between with the president of Costa Rica, as we're doing at the moment. But the fact, the new element that's coming in is that you have now those difficult alliances arising in Latin America between Venezuela, Ecuador, Bolivia, Honduras, Nicaragua on one side, and on the other side, of course, Colombia and other countries, and Brazil trying to play a sort of go-between between all these different nations. And that makes it rather difficult as we're going on, because those countries are not only thinking in terms of how can we solve the Honduras situation, but they're thinking much more about how my influence in this area will be enhanced by the possible solution that we may find with this Honduras difficulty. And this is bringing more and more time for negotiation, pushing different actors to come into it, looking at the way maybe the UN could get involved, and all this makes it quite difficult. Now, of course, and this is the second point I would like to explain with the reality of the day, is that all these challenges have implication for the way we want to manage this global world and this global community we're facing. I think, and here also I will try to push forward three simple ideas. The first one, I think, is that no nation today can have a solution and can make a solution on its own. Even if you have, like your country, a major power, of course, in the world, the reality of today is that you can't do it on your own. You can't act on your own and hope to solve solution, to bring solution to challenges that are so complex and so intertwined as they are today. And I think what we've seen recently with the economic crisis has been very obvious. When Lehman Brothers broke down and you had this bankruptcy and everybody was looking at disarray to what we should do, we discovered very quickly that altogether we had to do very simple things. First one was to share information and exchange information about what was going on our mutual markets. And that if we didn't do that, everybody was going to try to get out of that crisis in the wrong way because we didn't have enough information on each other. And that was absolutely a necessary and indispensable resources, information, that we needed to have if we wanted to do something valuable. The second thing that we discovered very quickly is that we had also to work together, even if in the end we were going to take national measures for a stimulus plan or whatever it is, that we needed to work together to know what the other one was doing and to try to have some sort of cooperation and complementary solution. And in fact, and to be honest, in spite of all the criticism we've heard here and there, this has worked rather well, because in the end, every country, more or less on its own, has taken stimulus plan, more or less of the same magnitude, and has been working hand in hand with the others rather well. But there is a third element that we have discovered at the time, is that we needed also a multilateral answer to that financial crisis. And that's what came out with those G20 meetings, the first one taking place in Washington, as you know, the second one in London, and the third one very soon in September in Pittsburgh. We needed those multilateral meetings, not only to keep on exchanging our information, but to try to set up some common rules for all of us. Because if we didn't do that, then the threat of protectionism, the threat of dumping in our regulation, in our financial regulation, would cost us a lot and create barriers among our countries, barriers among our financial markets, barriers among our economic market that would have been disastrous for the outcome of that crisis we're trying to get out. We still have a lot to do there, but we have discovered that there we really needed something to work together, and that on our own, none of us could find a solution. I think the second feature, and I would stress that a lot because my President, Nicolas Sarkozy, stressed that a lot, so I am his advocate here and I better speak about that. It's the importance of time. Time is of the essence for any solution we want to reach at the moment. It's not only because our president is a very dynamic and energetic president. I think he's right on that one. The complex world we're living in, the global world we're living in, has accelerated events and the evolution of events as they're going on. Look at the way a situation in Asia is going quickly and going very quickly. Diplomats, you know diplomats, they like to take their time. They think that the solution will find itself if we just don't do anything and let things go out. This is not true anymore. Today, events run very quickly. You see it in the Middle East. You see it in Afghanistan. Between the time when your president came out with his new strategy, it was in March, and what's happening now in the middle of August, where we're waiting for a new report by General McChrystal, and maybe we'll have to adapt a little bit of that strategy as we go on. Events on the ground in Afghanistan and Pakistan bring every day something new. If we're not able to answer and to give a reaction as quickly as possible, events will overcome us as we go along, and time is really becoming something absolutely essential. And I think and this is the third thing I wanted to say, one of the results of that acceleration of time is that we have to change our method and we have to change our institution. This is what is usually called, at least in France, we like to use grandiose concepts. It's like what we used to call today the governance and the governance of the world. And I think we're facing one of those moments when we have to think about the way we have gone through with this governance, which means in simple terms, how do we work together to have a better management of the world today? And we see that as regard to our institution, the Security Council in the UN has to be changed. You can't go on working with permanent members where you don't have countries like Brazil, for instance, South Africa, India, just think India not being permanent member of the Security Council, and other ones. Of course, I could speak also about Germany, who is not a permanent member, or Japan, who is not a permanent member. These two countries are major financial contributors to the UN, and they're not permanent members of the Security Council. If you want the Security Council to retain some sort of credibility, authority, legitimacy, you have slowly to change the format and the size of this Security Council without losing the efficiency of the whole system, but with the need to improve the membership if you want it to regain some legitimacy. And the same thing is true about the G7, G8 meetings. The truth is, as the crisis has been going on, we've had to adapt ourselves and create this G20 that was there already in the past, but that was never used to manage all the economic affairs. It was a nice place where you had exchange of views between finance ministers on the financial sector. Suddenly they have been promoted to becoming the place where heads of state and government are trying to deal with the major economic issues of today. And I think this tells a lot about how we have to adapt the G8 meetings, maybe to mix them and make only one meetings of those G8 on one side and G20 meetings. But it's true to say that you just can't go on with the G8 meeting dealing about Europe, about international affairs, and countries like China, India, once again, and many others, Brazil, Mexico, and many others, not being part of those meetings, so that it's necessary to ask them to come and attend the dessert or stay there for a while and then get out of the room because they're not real member of the club. I think we really have to change that, and this is going to be a major challenge as we go ahead. So these are, I think, the main features of the global world we're living in. Now, let me give you a few words about French position compared to those challenges we're facing. I think the first thing I would say, the first element of thought that I would give to you is to tell you how France's position is today in the world with regard to the three major alliances she's in fact. France is a member of the UN, France is a member of the Transatlantic Partnership, and of course, France is a member of the European Union. And on these three alliances, what we see is that France is taking initiatives in every one of these instances to try to improve, as I was saying, update, and give a new momentum to each one of these alliances. In the UN, I will be very brief. I just said a few words about what we think should be done with the Security Council if we want the UN to keep its legitimacy and to remain the place where the whole world community gathers every time we're facing a crisis, whether it be a political crisis or something else, the main place where we gather to try to solve the issue. I know that in this country, UN has not always been as popular as can be in Europe. You have quite often the impression that this is a very strong bureaucratic body that is unable to find its way out. And it's right to say that quite often there has been many shortcomings there. But I think it's still the only place that we have been able to set up where all the international community, all the nations that make the international community have been able to gather and work there. So this is a place where certainly we have to find a new dynamism, a new momentum if we want to do something great. And it's not only about the Security Council I was talking a few minutes ago. It's also about the whole question of environment and the climate change. We will have, I think, if we manage at one point to get an agreement either in Copenhagen or later on, we will have to create a new body that will be in charge of that in the UN. Let's try to find something that will not be bureaucratic, but let's try to think about a place where we can all gather to be sure that the commitments we have taken during the Copenhagen negotiation, all those commitments will be implemented, controlled, verified, checked up as we go along, and I think that's very important. With regard to the Atlantic Alliance, now first of all, as you know, France is back. It's definitely back into NATO. To tell you the truth, I think France never really went away from NATO. We went away from the military organization, and slowly, year after year, we slowly creeped in again in the military committees, in the meetings of defense ministers, exactly. There was one instance where we were not yet back. It was the military organization, and there we are. But never forget that even if we were not totally back into the military institution, if we kept this autonomous position, we were always there when we needed to be there with NATO, and we needed to send troops to do some peacekeeping mission, whether in the Balkans, whether in Afghanistan, whether in other parts of the world. We've been there. We are, in fact, after the United States and Britain, the third nation in the world with the most important military troops outside of our own country, because we have a lot of involvement in Africa, in the Balkans, in South Lebanon, as you know, where we're trying to maintain peace between Lebanon and Israel, and other countries who are still there also. So we have been, and now we're total part of the Atlantic Alliance, but at the same time, we all agreed that we have to update this Atlantic Alliance. We're talking at the moment about a new strategic concept, and France wants to take its part in defining this new strategic concept. And it's even more than that. It's the whole question about what should be the next missions of NATO. Take, for instance, what's happening at the moment in Afghanistan. One of the features we're discovering, one of the shortcomings that we're discovering as we're going ahead in Afghanistan, is that we not only have this military dimension to the conflict, but we have this huge civilian dimension to the conflict, the kind of assistance we can give to the Afghan people in terms of education, in terms of governance, in terms of helping them to set up a just judicial system and many other things of that kind, to help them build a strong agriculture and other things of that kind. And as we go on, we discovered that there is lack of coordination about what we're doing on one hand on the military side and what we're doing on the other hand on the civilian side. Who should coordinate that? Should it be NATO? Should it be the UN? Should it be the European Union, which is putting a lot of civilian assistance in those two countries? We have to see that. We have to look at which of these institution is the best fit and the best equipped and has the most experience in those fields. But it is definitely a major issue that we're going to face. And then the third alliance for France, of course, is the European Union. Now, what can be said about the European Union, you have to admit, if you look at where we were 50 years ago and what we have done since then, that it is a tribute to the way our European Union has been able to set up and implement peace and prosperity in the whole European continent. When you remember what happened at the time of the fall of the Berlin Wall, and you started to fear that disputes were appearing between Hungary and Romania, between the two parts of Czechoslovakia, the Czech Republic on one side, Slovakia on the other side, the fact that we brought all those countries together and told them, you're going to be a member of the European Union, we're going to accept you inside the European Union on one condition, is that you don't fight with your neighbor and that you accept peace on the continent, and you will get prosperity as a counterpart to that peacekeeping process. This has worked rather well. But now we are at a moment where we're going to get updated and modernized institutions, which is very good. We all hope we're going to be able to ratify the Lisbon Treaty in the very near future. But that will not be enough. The real problem that the European Union is going to face in the next months ahead is to ask the 27 members of this European Union whether they agree and where they are willing and they share this willingness to play a bigger part in the world affairs. In other words, is Europe ready to play its part in world affairs, to take a share of its duty and obligation, to come up with clear proposal, and to be ready and self-confident enough to be able to play a major part as Europe as such in tomorrow's world. And this is, mind you, is going to be a major challenge, because we are 6 or 7 of the major countries that are ready to go along with that. But many of our partners have doubts about that and wonder whether it's necessary for them to get involved in those world affairs, and still wonder whether Europe must be more than only an economic single market, a huge, important currency today, the euro, if it really has to play a part in the world defense and in the world diplomacy. So we're going to have to ask ourselves those questions and exchange our views on that. As we go along, and I will end a too long speech, and I apologize, if we go along those 3 alliances and try to move along, I think that what France will retain at its main inspiration as we go along are three very simple principles. The first one, and this has always been part of French diplomacy, as long as you can try to find a peaceful solution, try it. You need, first of all, to go through all the peaceful negotiation process in order to find a solution. It's not always easy, and we understand that. That's one of the reasons why we had this controversy with this country, with the whole question of Iraq, as you remember. We thought that you had to go through the whole peaceful process before going, if necessary, to the use of force. France remained very much of that position, and we want to go on doing that. That doesn't mean that we must be looking for appeasement always. Force is sometimes necessary, and as I was telling you, we have shown that by acts. The fact that we are there in South Lebanon, that we are in Ivory Coast, that we are at the border between Chad and Sudan on the whole question of the Darfur, that we are in Afghanistan, of course, where we've had casualties like everybody else, unfortunately. That tells you a lot about we're ready when necessary, and after we trying all the other peaceful means, we are ready to resort to force if necessary. The second one, of course, it's about justice, the second inspiring theme for us. And when I mean justice, it has a lot to do when we fight terrorism, of course, around the world. France has been of the position that even if we're fighting people who are refusing to abide by law, and this is usually what happens with terrorists, of course, that we must keep the right of law and the rule of law at the heart of our position and of our attitude. We think it is very important to retain that because we think that this is a value and a principle that we want to rely on. And of course, the third one, it's all about tolerance and the need for dialogue also. We in France think that one of the major challenges we're facing today also is this need for dialogue between cultures and civilizations that are very different from us. And I'm not talking only about the Muslim world, which is the most obvious one. Let me give you another example. It's about Africa also. Look at the way we have pushed forward the International Criminal Court and its process against the Sudanese president. We've come to a result. He's been indicted. And to our surprise, I must say, to many of us, we discovered that our African country altogether refused absolutely to go along that, saying in very blunt terms that this rule of law in the International Criminal Court was a law set up by the Western countries where the African countries had not their say, and therefore they refused to go along with the decisions that were taken there. So there is a misunderstanding there that we have to dispel, and that means more dialogue with African countries, more tolerance to look at their views and try to understand what they're telling us, and try to find a common ground. Last word, and I'll end there. There is no doubt that on this very large menu I have presented to you on the different challenges, the kind of work we have to do, the partnership with the United States is a very important one. We share the same values, the same principles, the same commitment. We still think today that we are the major influence in the world. But let's be cautious. Today, if you look at the transatlantic partnership, we still represent something like 50% of the world's wealth. We still represent something 1/6 out of the global population in the world. If we let the trends go on in 30 or 40 years, we will only represent 1/9 of the world population and something like 1/3 of the world's wealth because of the competition and the economic growth of China, India, and many other countries. So let's beware. Our influence could be dwindling. This is the time when we can still have a lot of influence on world affairs, and we better, coming back to what I was saying about the importance of time, this is the time, and let's not let it go and not take and seize this opportunity. It should be done. Sorry for being too long, but I'm quite ready to answer your questions. Thank you.
I'm Patrick Kennedy. I direct the speaker series. We have time for a few questions. We have 2 mics roaming around. If you would raise your hand, we'll pass you the mic. And I saw a hand over there. Start with you, ma'am. Yes.
We're happy to have you.
Can I use the water? Thank you.
We're happy to have you here. I hate to start with such a question, but would you say something about French agricultural policy?
If you wish, it could last hours, but I'll be very short. Well, as you know, first of all, the first point is that French agricultural policy is not autonomous anymore. We're totally involved in the European Union, and it is an exclusive competence of the European Union. So France can only do something on its agriculture if it has the agreement of the others, qualified majority, if the European Commission agrees with that. So that is a major change from, let's say, 30 or 40 years ago. Now the agricultural policy is totally taken care of and managed by Brussels. We have our say among 27 countries, so that's a small say. Even in France, can shout very loudly when we talk about agriculture. I agree with you on that. What we're ready to do with regard to the Doha cycle is that, just like your country is ready to do that, we're ready to lower our subsidies, and this is a major commitment from France that was not easy to get and to have our farmers agree on, but they are ready to do that. If the foreign markets and the markets from the emerging countries, the farm markets from the emerging countries are open to our products, first of all. And secondly, of course, if we get some sort of a compensation with regard to industrial goods, to services, to better control on intellectual property and other things that are there in the basket of the discussion at the moment inside the Doha cycle. And those compensations, we haven't got them yet at the moment. We're exactly on the same position as the American administration at the moment. We don't have enough from China, from India, from Brazil, so we need to keep on discussing. Otherwise, we won't accept those reduction of our farm subsidies if we don't get something back in those sectors. So this is where we are at the moment. The second point, and I will end that, our farm sector is still very active, I must say, and I'm impressed by that. You must remember that at one time, we were so arrogant with our wine industry that we thought that nobody will be able to compete with it. And we looked at California wine, Australian wine with a little bit of arrogance there and quite sure of ourselves, too much self-confident. We have discovered the reality. They're very good wines. They're very competitive. And we had to adapt our wine activities to that. And we have done that rather well in the last 7 or 8 years, I must say. So it's going to be very interesting to see how things are going on in the future. Thank you.
Question over there. Right there, sir.
When you go to college in this country, normally you're required to study Western civilization, which is a story of the rise of Greek, Roman, Europe, United States, as if our history is world history. And it also is the story primarily of the spread of Christianity, sometimes by force. Right now in this globalization process that you've been talking about, you mentioned culture. In a not too distant future, we're going to see the world economic #1 power probably be China. Totally different religion. Part of the big conflict in the Middle East is still, again, Christianity, Judaism, and Islam. Where's France in relationship, being a primarily Christian country like this country, and starting some kind of dialogue or leading, and how do we talk about global religion?
First point, I totally agree with you. Our education system as France doesn't help young students to know enough about civilizations of the outside world, I would say, out of our Christian, white, European, American civilizations. And I think we have to do much more of that. We usually become an expert on those issues when you come to university, and in college, high school, sorry, you usually don't do much about that. And this is very important. I think we'll have to change that. My personal impression, just to give you a very broad idea, is that I think we all know that we're living in a global world, but we haven't adapted our habits yet, whether they be personal, educational, professional. I can speak of diplomats. I think we're still too much self-centered on the Western world and not looking enough at what's going on outside there, and trying to understand how those people think, how Africans think, how Chinese think, how Indians think about the future of the world community. We need much more to do there. So that's the first point. The second point, where France stands on that, exactly on what I was trying to say before about dialogue. We need not only to dialogue with those different communities, religious communities or different parts of the world, but we have to understand what are the issues they're facing and try to help them, if possible, in very humble terms, in very humble way, try to help them to get the best out of their struggles. Let's go for Muslim, for instance. What's happening today in the Muslim world, and we can see it very easily in Egypt, in Saudi Arabia, even in Iran, at what's happening at the present time. It's a battle between the moderates and the radicals. Moderates, maybe we shouldn't define them as such when, if we had time, but let's simplify it a little bit. People who are also ready for dialogue, who are ready to invent their own version of democracy, and we have to let them invent that own version of democracy, because we shouldn't try to force them to take our way of doing democracy. It wouldn't work. We have to take into account their national tradition, their culture, etc. But at least try to help those who really, sincerely, genuinely want to push democracy in their countries. And of course, on the other side, not help those who are the most radicals and really are looking for divisions and confrontation with the West. And I think this is really what we have to do. And it's not easy to find the proper way to do that, because every time we come and try to speak to the leaders of those countries, or even to the opposition in those countries, those people lack quite often confidence in us. They don't trust us very much. And so we have this wall of lack of confidence to go over. And that may take some time. But France is definitely on that line. And we say that we have to support some leaders in the Arab world that are trying precisely to implement that kind of dialogue. Look at what leaders like the King of Morocco, the King of Saudi Arabia, the King of Jordan are trying to do in terms of dialogue. Maybe it's not enough, maybe it's only a starting point, but it's better than nothing, and we really have to be on their side and to support what they're trying to do. We have to do that because they're very much criticized by some elements in their own society, and therefore I think it's important to do that.
Question right here.
I am so appreciative of everything you said about inclusion and respecting others, and tolerance and justice were words you mentioned. And while I appreciate that so much, I'm really curious about inside of France itself, with the influx of immigrants. I've read and watched some of what's going on. So how would you say is working inside of France, of implementing justice and tolerance with the immigrants that are coming into your country? And may I say thanks belatedly for all of the niceness you extended to expatriates from America when African Americans were going to France to seek a better life. That was a very good thing to learn historically as I was a little girl coming up.
Thank you for French history. I think on your question about immigrants, I think you have to make a distinction. I know that a lot of observers in this country, when they look at the French Muslim community, tend to think that all these people are immigrants and they are badly treated. we don't have definitive figures about the Muslim community in France because this is, mind you, surprisingly, forbidden by law. We are not allowed to do that because we like to believe, a clerical country that has some very strong principles so as to retain the French Republic as one and only, where everybody who comes in is a French citizen once he is there and cannot be seen as a member of a specific community. It is only the French community as such, the national community. So we don't have precise figures, but anyway, we have experts who have been dealing with that, and we know that we have around 8% of the population which is Muslim in France, of Muslim obedience. What you have to understand is that the majority, and very large majority of this 8% of the population are French citizens, in fact. They are the grandchildren of immigrants who came in the 50s. But they were born in France, and therefore they are French citizens, and they're living in France, and their problem is a problem of integration in French society. It's very difficult. Many of them live in the suburbs of the main cities, where they have very poor housing, very poor conditions for education, high levels of unemployment, sometimes 3 or 4 times the average level of unemployment in the rest of the country. Bad transports, etc., etc. And therefore, our problem there is to bring money, private money, public money, to invest in those parts of our territory so that people can find a better living and can get out of the very difficult conditions they're in. That's one thing. Then the second thing is the immigrants, and we still have a lot of inflow of immigrants in France. The problem we're facing there is that the vast majority of those immigrants come on illegal terms, just like in your country quite often. And of course, those illegal immigrants live in the most unsecure conditions, very poorly treated by their employers because they are illegal. And we have discovered many examples of that through incidents or accidents that have appeared. I was in France at the time. About 5 years ago, there was a huge fire in a very small hotel right at the center of Paris, near the Opera. And we discovered that this hotel was a refuge for illegal immigrants that were living in very poor conditions. There was no fire security, of course, and most of them were killed and were burnt in that accident. And this is typically the kind of situation where they are at the moment. So what the French authorities have decided is that we were quite ready to accept immigration, but it should be on legal terms. And therefore we have set up very strong principles for allowing immigrants to come and work in France. And we're fighting with the help of our European partners, illegal immigration. But you know, and I will end on that, the European dimension of this issue is becoming more and more important. Because nowadays, if for instance you refuse to an immigrant entrance to France, he can try to come through Italy, Belgium, Spain, Germany, whatever it is. Once he has entered one of those countries, he can travel freely into the others. And therefore, we all have to have the same rules at our outside borders, external borders, in order to be efficient in the way we're going to handle the whole question of illegal immigration. There we are. Thank you.
Time for one more question. Back there, Bob.
More question. Your healthcare system's going through some changes. If you would cover that, and is there something that we can learn from your healthcare system? And also, if you might touch upon, with this global economy, unions are very strong in France, so what kind of changes do you see taking place there?
The problem is our health system is built the other way around from yours. So I understand why it's difficult to go from your system to ours or from ours to yours. We are mostly on a system where, you know, it is compulsory to receive health care through a system where employers and employees pay a levy, a tax on their salaries on both sides, employers and employees. And the result of that is that every French citizen can be assured that he will get a minimum reimbursement by the state if he is ill. He can go to any hospital, private or public, and they will take care of him immediately. There is nothing about preconditions, etc. But of course, as this public reimbursement is usually, and more as we have scarce public resources limited, then people have gone for public and or private or insurance or corporation insurance on top of this public system. In other words, it's exactly the contrary of yours. And I'm not sure that we can be of any help to you in that. What I would add is that we're facing also more or less the same difficulties as you're facing in trying to control the health expenditures, which have grown tremendously in France. Every 5 or 6 years, whatever political majority we have in France, people try to put some capping on those expenditures, and we have always failed abysmally, I must say. It works during 1 or 2 years, and then it starts again. I suppose it has a little bit to do with human nature, I think. France, from what I understand, are the world champion in terms of drugs consumption. I thought that it was here in America, but it's not true. I think it's France. And it's very difficult to convince French to limit the use of drugs in their country. So we try to work with doctors, we try to work with hospitals, we signed up protocols or things of that sort. It never really has worked. So we're once again in a new process of trying to find a solution because we have growing deficits in our healthcare system at the moment in France. So welcome to the club.
Ladies and gentlemen, let's give a round of applause. Mr. Ambassador, thank you.